World leaders condemn the bloodshed in Myanmar. Security forces killed dozens, including children. The United Nations accuses the regime of committing mass murder. Thousands are evacuated as Islamist militants seize a town in Mozambique close to vital gas installations. Plus, a giant relic of the Cold War salvaged from the bottom of the sea. One of the last of its kind, the Caspian Sea Monster, is now going on display. I'm Michael Oku. A pleasure to have you with us. We begin in Myanmar, where anti-government protesters are back on the streets a day after security forces killed more than 100 civilians. World leaders have condemned the bloodshed. The United Nations says the military is committing mass murder against its own people. Thousands have fled from Myanmar into neighboring Thailand.
The funeral of a 13-year-old boy. He died when security forces opened fire, though there were no protests in the area, neighbors say. According to witnesses, at least 6 children between the ages of 10 and 16 died during Saturday's bloodbath.
So, of course, they are the killing not only the people, they are the killing the elderly, they are the killing the disabled people, they are the killing the people who are the underage, even they cannot speak well in that.
The violence coincided with Myanmar's armed forces holiday. While generals celebrated with a military parade, security forces were opening fire indiscriminately on the streets. The defense chiefs of 12 nations have released a joint statement denouncing the junta's massacre of civilians. But rights groups want to see more than words from the international community, given the military's track record.
This is a military that's had a long history of impunity and committing atrocities against its people. The difference is this time around, we're seeing photographs coming out in real time. We can't say that we didn't know what was happening.
Despite the killings, there's little sign that protesters are going home. On Sunday, they built barricades to stave off security forces in Yangon. They're not prepared to let the generals keep control of their country.
Reporter A. Min Thant has been covering events from Myanmar for us. She joins us now from neighboring Bangkok. I imagine yesterday's massacre was a turning point. What are you hearing about the mood there?
So after yesterday's killings, a lot of people in the streets, as well as people who have been supporting the civil disobedience movement, have really began to talk about violence as a way to achieve the ends that they're looking for. And quite a number of people are now signing up to join trainings that are being provided by ethnic armed organizations on how to resist in ways that are less than peaceful. And you talked earlier about the global condemnation of the junta by the world's militaries, as well as many governments around the world. But people are seeing that Russia, China, as well as other countries such as Pakistan and Bangladesh were attending in the Damodar events yesterday. And so people are really looking towards self-reliance as well as non-peaceful means to achieve their ends now.
You say non-peaceful means, you say self-reliant, and that goes right into my second question for you, which is, how much more death can the protesters bear among their ranks before they turn violent themselves?
So I think we're already seeing protesters turn towards violence. So in the days leading up to yesterday's events, there has been talk among the public about forming a federal army, a new Myanmar military that is outside of the Damodar, the existing Myanmar army, one that is made up partially of ethnic armed groups, but also of civilians who would become soldiers into this new army. And we've also seen protesters start to pick up weapons, whether that be just throwing rocks or people who are bringing slingshots to protest, as well as using Molotov cocktails and other sorts of homemade weapons.
Well, as things are ratcheted up, that might not be good news for either side here. As government troops continue killing peaceful protesters, are there any signs of dissent in the military's ranks?
We have seen a number of soldiers defecting, although it's quite few. There's been more police who've defected. There's a number of people who have defected and sought refuge in India. There's over 300 people now seeking refuge in India, and quite a number of them are police. There's also been a number of police officers who have fled central Myanmar into regions controlled by ethnic armed organizations in order to keep themselves and their families safe while refusing to obey orders from their superiors to hurt civilians. We haven't seen quite as many defections from the military, though.
That's reporter A. Min Than for us. Thank you so much, as always.
Thank you.
Let's briefly highlight some other stories making news around the world at this hour. Police in Bangladesh have opened fire on protesters. People gathered despite a nationwide general strike. They're protesting against a visit by Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Critics accuse his Hindu Nationalist Party of encouraging religious polarization in India and discriminating against Muslims. Engineers have still failed to free the huge freighter stuck in the Suez Canal. Tens of billions of dollars in cargo have been held up for days. The Egyptian president has told authorities to remove containers from the grounded Ever Given. For the second time in as many weeks, Beijing has been blanketed in dust by a dangerous sandstorm. Visibility was severely reduced and the air quality index rose beyond the maximum safe level. Those who ventured outside had to take special precautions against pollution. At least 20 people have been injured in a suicide bombing outside a Catholic cathedral in Indonesia. Authorities say 2 attackers were killed on the island of Sulawesi. The injured were attending Mass to mark the start of Easter week. Police say there are links to supporters of the so-called Islamic State, linked to other church bombings in Indonesia and the Philippines.
The beginning of Easter week is a holy time for Christians, but in Makassar the celebrations were marred by violence. As worshippers were leaving Sunday Mass, 2 suspected suicide bombers set off explosions outside the Indonesian city's main Catholic cathedral. One of them was said to be a woman. It happened during the shift change of prayers. The attacker was trying to enter our church, and one of our staff was suspicious when the attacker was trying to stand near the gate. Later, the bomb exploded. President Joko Widodo called for calm, saying his government would ensure people of all faiths can worship without fear.
Saya mengutuk keras aksi terorisme tersebut dan
I strongly condemn the terrorism act, and I have given instruction to the police chief to take down the terrorist network to the root.
jaringan itu sampai ke akar-akarnya.
Places of worship in Indonesia have been targeted before. Police are investigating if this attack is linked to religious extremism. The majority Muslim country has a history of Islamist attacks. Indonesia has been on high alert in recent months following the arrest of the prominent leader of an extremist group. Counter-terrorism squads have arrested dozens of suspects across the country, including in Makassar.
Thousands of people have been evacuated from a gas-rich town seized by militants in Mozambique. Survivors of what authorities are calling an Islamist attack have arrived in the provincial capital, Pemba. They were evacuated from Palma by land and sea. Militants are keeping the town under siege. The French energy group Total is building a multi-billion-dollar gas project there. Our correspondent, Adrian Krish, was in Mozambique before the latest fighting began and is following these events from Cape Town. Adrian, what more do we know about the attack at this point?
Michael, we understand that fightings in Palma are still ongoing, but at the same time, evacuation plans are outrolled. Vessels is taking about 2,000 people from Palma to the regional capital of Pemba, half of them staff of Total. But it seems that thousands are still stuck in the city. They don't get out. South African media houses report of dozens of people who have been killed already, at least one South African. Apparently, convoy of cars tried to get out of a hotel and was ambushed by the terrorists. But again, we have very little information at this point. It is speculated that many people are still even stuck in this very hotel, but it is so difficult to get information. You said it, phone networks have been down since Wednesday. The government only confirmed that there is an attack, but they do not give any further information, and they also don't allow journalists to go to this area.
Adrian, can you give us a big picture perspective? What exactly is happening in Mozambique right now?
So the local people there call the group Al-Shabaab, although they have nothing to do with the group with the same name in Somalia. Al-Shabaab there basically started very similar in an insurgency that we saw in northeastern Nigeria with Boko Haram. You have a poor area of the country, one of the poorest areas within the country, a lot of people who are angry that the government is not investing anything and the government is not listening. A few people are radicalizing. The response by the security forces is to crack down on them, which radicalized even more people. So that way things spiraled out of control, and while the government was busy downplaying things, we have a situation that we see at the moment. When we were there last month, we heard the most gruesome stories from civilians who were running away from these areas, villagers who saw their neighbors decapitated in front of them, children being kidnapped, and there's so many of these stories. It has been happening for months. It is not clear what the group really wants, but it is likely that it is more about power and access to resources than it is about religion.
It's sounding very much like a country in crisis. What's likely to be the impact of both the attack and Total's decision to withdraw?
Well, if they really finally withdraw and they will not come back, this will have disastrous effects on the economy of Mozambique. It's the sixth poorest country in the world, and the government was hoping to make more than $98 billion within the next 25 years because of the gas exploitation. This is unlikely to happen because up until now the exploitation hasn't started. This is all in a very early stage. Although companies already invested a lot, they haven't started selling any gas. So if they don't do that, obviously that will have disastrous effects on the economy and for the government as well.
Adrian Krish reporting. As always, Adrian, much thanks. Transitioning now to a giant relic of the Cold War that's been salvaged from the bottom of the sea. The hybrid ship aircraft was once the showpiece of the Soviet military aviation. Only a few were ever built. Now the craft is going on display for flight fans to admire.
Gigantic, fast, dangerous. The Akronoplan is half ship, half aircraft. 40 years ago, it was designed for amphibious warfare between the Soviets and Western powers. It was this man who tested the flying boat, Aligachi Abdulgalimov. He was the Caspian Sea Monster's board engineer.
But
it wasn't a monster. Back then, there were plans to even use the Akronoplan for passenger transport because it didn't need large runways and airfields. The Akronoplan was designed in the 1980s. It was built to protect the Russian coast and destroy the enemy fleet. And it was meant to do this without being detected by radar. The parasail glider moved with the help of the so-called ground effect. Its wings generated pressure and lifted the 380-ton flying boat a few meters above the water, allowing it to move at higher speeds. But the flying machine was never actually used on a real mission. The Seacraft is ruined, the work of many designers and engineers, but it's good that it's still here, because some people were considering dismantling it and using the parts for scrap metal. The Caspian Sea Monster will be displayed at Patriot Park in Dagestan. The Seacraft symbolizes modern Russia, drawing parallels to its ancient strength.
Well, Germany is moving ahead in its drive to abandon coal as a fuel for generating electricity. A coal-fired power station in the Ruhr industrial area has been blown up after coming to the end of its working life. The cooling tower, boiler house, and a 250-meter-high chimney were all demolished in controlled explosions. The German government is committed to phasing out coal by 2038. The site had been generating electricity for 80 years. You're watching DW News. Up next, our current affairs series Reporter. I'm Michael Oku from me and the entire news team here in Berlin. Thanks so much for watching.